Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you for the last event of the quarter. And my guest today is my friend Heidi Williams. Heidi is the Charles Schwab Professor of Economics. She's now transitioning to a role as a professor of economics at Dartmouth College. And Heidi's research is on the causes and consequences of technological change in healthcare markets. She studies economic incentives and policy factors that affect medical innovation, and she quantifies the impact of missing innovation that could have been beneficial for human health and for medicine. Now, Heidi is a huge public good provider. She's working tirelessly on how society can best support science and innovation, and how we can best ensure that science and innovation generate broad benefits for society as a whole. She is the director of science policy at the Institute for Progress, a nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C. She's a co-chair of JPAL's Science for Progress initiative, and she's a co-director for the National Bureau of Economic Research's Innovation Policy Working Group. I hope you could, because my voice is so loud, I trust that you could hear me even without the microphone, but I apologize if you didn't. And Heidi is also the lead editor of the Journal of Economic Perspectives. Now, Heidi is a 2015 MacArthur Fellow for unraveling, and I quote, for unraveling the causes and consequences of innovation in healthcare markets. Her citation for the award noted that Heidi builds entirely new data sets about technological changes in healthcare, and that her creative methods for determining causal inference and keen understanding of regulatory law and biological science and medical research have allowed her to trace the interplay among institutions, market behavior, and public policy relevant outcomes. Heidi is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Econometric Society, and she is the recipient of the Alfred Sloan Research Fellowship, among many other prizes. Heidi has also been recognized multiple times for her outstanding teaching and advising. So welcome, Heidi, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So Heidi, my first question to you is, how did you end up in economics? And how did you end up working on the economics of science and innovation in particular?
So I remember when I was an undergraduate, I found a paper that an economist named Bill Nordhaus had written, which basically quantified that if you value the gains in longevity, so how long people are living over like the last century, the value of that looked about the same as the value of the growth in the rest of the economy, so all goods and services other than health. But what's interesting is policymakers and economists focus a lot of attention on GDP growth as like a concept that we care about. But here was this paper saying that actually growth in lifespans is as valuable as GDP growth, even though we don't value those gains in health in GDP directly. And so I thought that was very interesting. So I started to look into, what do we think has driven gains in health and longevity over that period? And so, over time, it turns out there's kind of an interesting cycle. At some point, public health investments were really important, but over the last, 5 decades, people think that medical technologies and improvements in the way that we care for patients in like a very innovation-oriented sense are really what's responsible for the fact that people live longer now than they did in, say, 1970. And so economist David Cutler has like some of the nicest case studies of this. If you were born as a preterm baby in the 1970s, your outlook for kind of living a healthy life was just much worse than it is now. Or if you had a heart attack in the 1970s, your outlook for living a healthy life was much worse than it is now. And the reasons that those have changed are things like neonatal intensive care units and surfactant, which is a drug that helps with underdeveloped lungs if you're born too early, or statins and beta blockers, which really reduce the likelihood that you die from heart disease. And so there's actually kind of a lot of consensus that those case studies suggest, which is the reason we're living longer now than we were in the 70s was because of medical technology. But then I went and looked at, well, that's interesting, so what do health economists work on? And it turns out they almost all were working on health insurance, which is of course very important and is a determinant of which technologies we get access to. But it's quite different from saying, well, let's try to understand the factors of what determines the rate and direction of innovation in healthcare markets. And are we getting the right technologies developed? Or are there some cases where there are scientifically feasible technologies that aren't being brought to market because we're not providing the right incentives? And so I got very interested in trying to think about how to work on these kind of, what I now think of as the classic questions in the economics of innovation in the context of healthcare, partly because it seemed like an area where our potential to say that, this is kind of a big enough problem to matter. Like if we're getting something wrong and we fix it, it looks like that could really matter for human health and welfare, seemed big. And so my first kind of job in that space was I sent a cold email to Michael Kremer, who at the time was an economist at Harvard, and kind of asked if he needed a research assistant.
Later won the Nobel Prize.
He later went on to win the Nobel Prize, although not for the work that I worked on as a research assistant, unfortunately. So, but I kind of said that I was really interested in this work he was doing on medical innovation, and I caught him on the right day, and so I started working with him. So his big idea was, let's think about where there are disconnects between the social value of a given technology and the private incentives to produce it. And so the example he was focused on was for malaria vaccines. So this is something we think would really have the potential to save a lot of lives, but those are mostly lives of poor people that don't have an ability to pay kind of high prices. And so if you only expect to get a low price, then very few private firms are going to come in to try to develop that. And so his idea was, can we design kind of an advance purchase contract so that governments or philanthropies will pay more so that we'll have a private incentive for people to come in and develop the technologies that are needed in poor countries that we think would really lift people out of poverty by improving their health. And so I thought that was just such an interesting area, and it was this beautiful combination of like economic theory. So in addition to Michael Jung Levin, who's at Stanford, and Susan Athey, who's at Stanford, and Chris Snyder, who's now my colleague at Dartmouth, we're kind of doing the economic theory of how do you want to write these contracts. And there were some lawyers involved of how do you actually write a legally binding agreement that could implement this contract in practice. And we were relying heavily on some empirical work by economists like Chris Adams, who's now at the Congressional Budget Office, who were trying to model kind of like what are the risks and costs of drug development, and how do you actually model like what amount of incentive you would need to, in expectation, get new drugs to come to market. And so it was just such an interesting blend of so many different types of economics. And I helped with kind of a lot of things that were not strictly research. So Michael and his wife, Rachel Gunnister, were writing a book. I did a lot of background research for the book, did a lot of background kind of policy brief writing, like public-facing writing, but it wasn't like research in a traditional academic journal sense. And at the same time, the process of doing that non-research work, for me, surfaced questions that are very fundamental, basic research questions that then motivated me to want to go get a PhD to try to understand how to do research on those questions that I never would have thought of unless I had been doing this practical work to start with. And so one example is a reason why you might like this proposal that Michael was talking about is because in theory, you could structure those payment agreements such that the malaria vaccine wouldn't be under patent, but would actually be in the public domain. And that might make it easier for other firms to build on that technology and develop better malaria vaccines. And so there was an economist, Suzanne Scotchmer, who since passed away, but had some really nice theory papers on why that cumulative effect on innovation could be really important, but people actually hadn't worked on that empirically. And so that actually ended up being kind of a problem that I worked on for my dissertation. That's just a question I never would have thought of had I not done this kind of more policy work with Michael. And so it was just such a rewarding experience for me, partly because Michael was a great mentor, but partly also because I feel like I really got a sense that I like economics as a place where you can go out in the world and kind of choose problems that you think really matter and have those inspire research questions that you then kind of come back and find the right data and find the rigorous approach to actually getting sort of a empirically founded answer, so that it's not just people's opinions that are guiding how we do policy decisions, but we can actually just have that be informed by research. And so, of course, the way that you do that if you want to learn how to do research is you go get a PhD. And I've been
so
really
then you went
here.
to get a PhD, and your dissertation work was about patents and innovation in healthcare markets. So can you tell us about this work?
Sure. So when I was in grad school, like I said, I was interested in this topic of patents. It turns out lots of people are interested in it. It's kind of a hard topic to study because it's hard to get data that's not measured by patents on what people are innovating on in the economy. And so it's probably pretty intuitive that you can't use patents to measure innovation if what you're interested in is how patents affect innovation. Because if we have stronger patent laws, you might get more patents filed, but that doesn't mean that there's actually more invention going on in the economy. And so I knew that I needed a context where you could measure innovation separate from patenting. And I was interested in healthcare markets. And when I was in grad school, there was a case going through the court system on whether we should patent human genes. And it was interesting because I originally thought, well, that's not really a place that economists have to contribute. And the reason was the lawsuit was brought by the ACLU, and it was very philosophical, almost in origins, of like, should we be able to patent things that are in the human body? And those are the kinds of questions that economists look at and say, well, we don't really have a lot to say about that. But it turns out that some of the court decisions were very much making economic arguments that actually our work could have spoken to, but there wasn't work from us to inform them. And so basically at the end of the day, the Supreme Court ruling that eventually came out was very narrowly saying, we think you shouldn't be able to patent genes because we think that the harms to medical innovation are larger than the benefits. And so, that's like a question that's completely in our wheelhouse. And so I had this like really wonderful experience of finding some histories of science books that were chronicling how the human genome got sequenced, and I figured out this way that you could actually try to study what the effects of intellectual property rights on the human genome were. And I didn't know any science, but I learned some science, partly even though she wasn't my advisor, Claudia Golden, who's at Harvard, who's a professor there, also a recent Nobel laureate, she very kindly sat in on a class with me, in basic biology so that I could learn enough molecular genetics to construct the data that I needed to do this. And, it just ended up being this really rewarding example of, here was a question that I started with from before grad school, but I learned enough science to actually try to do in practice kind of an empirical study that I really enjoyed. And at the same time, at the end of the day, I mostly was left with more questions than answers, which I think something is, Ran really identifies with. Any given paper that you write doesn't usually answer the question that you set out to answer, but it generates 5 other questions that you have that you can write papers on those. And so, it wasn't just like one dissertation. It was really like I wrote a first paper and realized all the reasons why it wasn't sufficient to answer the policy question I cared about, and then kept working on those 4 other papers. And I think that's another thing about academic research that I just really appreciate is, we have the opportunity to let research grow to fill the need. It's not like you have one question and then you need to move on to the next thing. And so it was just a really rewarding part of my career.
The premise of much of your work is that social science research should be informed by close collaboration with scientists in order to really improve public policies and even to cure cancer. For example, in one of your recent projects, you study what inventions we are missing that will help cure cancer. And so before I ask you about that research, maybe could you first tell us why is this at all an economics question? So can't it just be that scientists are not able to cure certain types of cancers despite their best effort, and that economists can't really help with that?
Yeah, so I definitely get a lot of emails from doctors and scientists that express that view, right? And so, and I want to be respectful. Some scientific problems are just hard, and I think that's a real thing. But for economists, I think we often think of it as a problem being hard probably reflects both some inherent scientific difficulty, but also how much time and effort and money people have invested in trying to make progress on that question. And so a lot of questions that are solved today, at some point people might have thought were impossible, but we made an investment in trying to do them, and it got easier. And so one thing that's nice about the economist view is it's empirically testable. So if you change the incentives or you change the investments, do you get different things developed? And so, when doctors say, well, I don't think incentives matter, I'm like, well, did you look at our paper? Because we kind of estimate that when you got a change in incentives, that changed investment. And in fact, new drugs got developed and people live longer. So, you don't have to believe me that incentives matter. I'm just showing you data and so if you have a problem with the data that I'm showing you, I'm happy to engage on, that. But your opinion that incentives don't matter is refuted by the data that I'm showing you, And so I do feel like our paper is not saying that scientific difficulty doesn't vary across different cancers, and so we're not rejecting that as a view. But I do feel like economists really have something to contribute to kind of say, almost like a much more optimistic view that like policy can matter because it can change incentives for what investments happen, and that can really change people's lives, or change their health outcomes in a way that we as a society really value. And so I think oftentimes, if you're not taking that kind of incentives matter view, it's just easy to fall into saying like, we can't do anything about these problems. They're just very intractable. And so even though economists often get dinged for being very dismal in their view, I actually feel like this is an area where we really have a lot to contribute to kind of say the world could be better, and we can kind of make it that way if we try to value, like Ran said, I often try to describe it as this missing innovation, so things that could have been developed but weren't. And that's not a concept that doctors think about very often. Another example is, pharmaceutical prices are always such a hot topic, right? Because we're concerned that high prices limit access to drugs. And so other countries often deal with that by having price controls in place. And you could think that price controls are improving welfare, but it is important to recognize that when countries have had price controls, so economist Margaret Kyle's work really shows this very directly, pharmaceutical firms choose to launch fewer drugs in countries that have price controls. And so you get cheaper access to the drugs that are introduced, but you get fewer drugs introduced into the market. And so it's a trade-off. And you could quantify both sides of that trade-off and say, we're making the right decision and we think we should have price controls. But I think sometimes if you're not measuring the innovation that isn't happening or the diffusion of innovation that isn't happening, you're not even having a conversation about the relevant trade-offs that people should be thinking about. And so I think there's a lot of cases where measuring what technologies people could have access to but don't is just a really important input into the debate, because oftentimes we're otherwise just having the debate on the wrong terms. Regardless of what the answer is that people decide at the end of the day, we should at least be constructing the data to kind of correctly measure all of the various costs and benefits.
So what kind of cancer drugs do you think we are missing that we could have if we improve the design of public policies?
Yeah, so the project that Ran is referring to is one that I wrote with an economic theorist, Eric Budish, and then a patent lawyer named Ben Rowan. And we kind of started with the observation that most drugs for cancer that are developed, if you just read the Wall Street Journal, are developed treating patients that are very late-stage cancer patients. And the clinical trials tend to suggest that instead of living for 6 months, you live for 8 months. And again, it could just be that it's easier to treat those kind of late-stage cancers. But I think there was a lot of concern being expressed that could be because it's actually not very profitable to develop drugs to either treat earlier stage cancers, and that you have a better chance of curing the cancer than you do at these very late stages. Or there's also been basically very little innovation on cancer prevention, and so we came in with a very specific hypothesis, which we ended up not really being able to speak to very sharply, which is we were wondering if the patent system played a role in that. And so the basic idea is that when you bring drugs to market in the US or elsewhere, you need to do clinical trials to show that your drug is safe and effective. And it turns out you need to file your patents before you start clinical trials. How long your clinical trials take depend in part on how long it takes to show statistically significant improvements in survival for the patients in your trial. And so if your patients die very quickly, your clinical trial can be very short. But actually, if you want to show that patients with early stage breast cancer live 12 years instead of 9 years, your trial has to be at least 9 years, because you have to show that you're accruing deaths in the control group at a faster rate than you're accruing deaths in the treatment group. And so there's this very mechanical incentive that once you start thinking about it, seems very morbid, that's kind of built into the system, where we're effectively providing more patent life for firms that do these short trials for these late stage cancers than we are for firms that would do these longer clinical trials to treat early stage cancers. The reason it was hard to make an argument that that was about the patent system is that if you talk to people that work on corporate finance, they're also just concerned that private firms in general might be too short-term in their thinking. So they might just want to do projects that are going to pay off sooner rather than later. That would kind of manifest itself in the same way. And so we ended up not writing the paper about patents, but more trying to say, is there a bias towards these shorter-term projects? And are we missing innovation on these longer-term projects? And the paper is interesting because it's not like there's one table that kind of convinces you that we know what's going on. It's sort of this collage of different pieces that we brought together. But just to give you a flavor of what we did, so there's a certain group of cancers where we've essentially always allowed people to not look at impacts on mortality, but rather look at impacts on outcomes that you observe much more quickly than mortality. And so for cancers of blood and bone marrow, basically if you have leukemia and the drug reduces the amount of cancer in your blood, that's accepted as a marker for your mortality will improve later, because that's kind of been a validated, what they call a surrogate endpoint. And so it turns out if you look at cancers which have the same life expectancy but are allowed to do shorter trials, you see much more investment in those. And so we sort of use that contrast to say, what if we allowed shorter clinical trials? Would that change investment? And it looks like the answer is yes. It really shifts what kind of drug trials firms are willing to sponsor. It also looks like the marginal drugs that are kind of developed that wouldn't have been developed otherwise really benefit patients. So it looks like you get like a lot of life years saved. It's not that we could say that that improved welfare, because then you kind of need to weight, the cost of R&D against these other, but it looks like it would be surprising if that weren't improving welfare. It looks like the gains for patients were like very large. And so we kind of did sort of a lot of analysis to try to say, it looks like if we had technologies that would let us run shorter clinical trials, it looks like that would be very good for patients and for firms and for society kind of more generally. And so that's like the kind of conclusion that's hard to make in a very precise way, but it is one of the papers that I kind of feel at the end of the day, like most compelling to me as like something that I believe is a result that is probably true,
So moving from the what kind of drugs to what kind of policies, what new policies would you recommend to better incentivize scientists to create new and effective drugs that are not currently available?
Yeah, so for good reasons, economists often shy away from making policy recommendations. As an academic, like my ability to engage with different people is largely stemming from I'm perceived as, I would hope correctly, as an unbiased kind of, I try to get the right data and I try to design kind of the empirical approach that's most accurate, and I try to draw conclusions, and not as an advocate that kind of starts with a conclusion and tries to build data to support that, right? So as soon as you venture into making policy recommendations, I think it can kind of confuse people on, are you, what role are you playing? So, that's just as a background that I generally hesitate to make policy recommendations. But in this case, like I said, you can kind of say we don't need a lot of assumptions to go from the data and the evidence that I showed you to kind of say at an abstract level, I think I understand like what would improve welfare from a policy perspective. So this idea of surrogate endpoints as a technology that can let you run shorter clinical trials, so that basically instead of waiting to show that your drug improves mortality, we can measure outputs on some outcome that you observe more quickly. Those are extremely controversial for like doctors and scientists. And the reason they're controversial is because lots of times pharmaceutical firms propose surrogate endpoints that aren't valid. And so a good example is for prostate cancer. For men that have prostate cancer, there's a prostate-specific antigen that you can measure in your blood that tells you kind of your, basically, it's used as a test for whether you have prostate cancer. It turns out the scientific evidence on if you take a treatment for prostate cancer and it reduces the PSA in your blood, is that actually going to improve your health? That evidence isn't very good, right? And so the concern with surrogate endpoints is we don't want to rely on inaccurate endpoints where drugs might generate some biological response in your body, but it's not actually indicative that your health is going to improve in some longer-term sense that we care about. And so because these invalid surrogate endpoints get proposed all the time, they're controversial to talk about because people say, well, surrogate endpoints don't work, or like firms propose these surrogate endpoints that don't work. And I think for economists, we can kind of help by changing the direction of the conversation. So I'm not talking about any specific surrogate endpoint. What I'm saying is, in theory, what we have is a case where society could invest in creating a technology that lets us run shorter trials. If we had those, my data suggests that we would get more trials conducted, and that the drugs that would come out, at least of the case study they would look at, are socially valuable. So let's think about how could we invest in getting better surrogates. So I'm not advocating that we use surrogates that people have ideas for now. I'm kind of interested in it more as like, how would we validate better surrogate endpoints? And so I'm not a doctor or a scientist. as best I can tell, that's kind of a statistics problem, which is interesting, partly because that's a very different case than saying like the National Institutes of Health needs to fund some biological research, And I think there is probably a role for public funding. If you look at where surrogates have come from in like heart disease, they largely grew out of the Framingham study, which was this multi-decade federally funded study that showed that there were some correlates of things like blood pressure and high cholesterol with heart disease mortality. That then formed the basis for some research that the Veterans Affairs Unit did to validate that actually if you do see changes in those did look like valid surrogates. So I think there's probably some role for public investment in just data collection to say like, can we have a Framingham study for cancer to like hypothesize about what the surrogates might be? But then it's very much a statistics problem, and actually Hedo Imbens, who came to talk here, is very interested in that as a statistics problem. So how do you take something that's a correlate and statistically say that this is a valid surrogate? That's an approach that I want to tell statisticians that I think is like an interesting problem to go work on. And so, but the policy recommendation is more about data collection and more research on this kind of surrogate validation, rather than saying that I think we should do X or Y kind of at the Food and Drug Administration. Although I will say that the one thing that I feel pretty confident in saying from the regulatory perspective for when the Food and Drug Administration needs to approve drugs is I think there's a lot of value in them being consistent with how they provide guidance to firms on where and when they can use surrogates, because pharmaceutical firms are making these like 10 or 12-year investments, and so whatever they say, they should be giving firms certainty that like it's not just a whim that they're saying now, it's something that they're really making a commitment to over the long term. It's been an interesting space for me to kind of gain exposure to what having like policy engagement looks like on this particular question, because it's very rife with concerns about conflict of interests. And so I remember when I was a junior faculty at MIT, I gave a talk on this paper at the National Institutes of Health because I had gotten a grant from them to fund some of the work. And it wasn't just NIH employees. It was kind of a public conference, so there were some non-NIH employees there. And I put up my first slide, and this person who was kind of more of an advocate was there and immediately interrupted me and asked, am I funded by the pharmaceutical industry for this research? Because it's seen as being very pro-industry. I'm saying we should do this thing which would make more profits for firms. Well, it turns out I'm saying that would also be good for society and good for patients, right? So I think there's this idea that somehow I wouldn't be up there talking about something that was good for firms unless I was funded by industry to say that. And I think that's a very dangerous trap to fall into, because we need to be able to talk about things that are not just good for society, but also good for firms, and not have those off the table. And so, I think conflict of interest concerns are real, and I absolutely think we should be concerned about them. But in this case, like the only people that kind of knew enough to understand the technical problem that I was working on were almost all immediately conflicted out from being involved in the policy discussions because they're from industry. And so, and this comes up a lot, for example, in AI policy discussions in DC right now, most people that would be the right people to have the technical expertise to engage in AI policy discussions are conflicted out because they're affiliated with one of the relevant firms. And so I think there's just some very important issues that we need to think about what does it mean to kind of have technical expertise in government making policy, and how do you balance kind of expertise with conflict of interest? And so this is a topic I really was drawn to work on because I mean from the policy side, partly because I felt like nobody was going to be making this argument unless I made it, because there were not a lot of people that were not conflicted out that understood the importance that I kind of saw in the problem. But even given that, I just felt like for me, it never felt very tractable to actually like have reforms move forward in that space. And that was of course discouraging, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen someday. It just means, that paper was published in 2015 and I haven't yet figured out kind of the right audience to communicate the work to in a way that's had any policy impact. I'll keep talking about it, and over time, different people are interested in talking about it, but it has been not the quick turnaround, that I think we might all dream for our research having an impact.
Can you recall a moment when you knew that your ideas were having an impact?
Yeah, so not that one really, that we were just talking about. So, it's always hard to know what's the counterfactual impact of your work. And so, this is like an impossible question for Ran to ask me. I will say that I'm like very naturally drawn to trying to work on areas where I think my counterfactual impact is likely to be big, right? And so, I can't say that I'm having an impact, but I can say that I'm trying to work on things where I hope that I will. So I can give you a recent example that I've been working on a lot lately. So there's this very old, very technical, you would think it's boring, but I'm going to try to convince you it's not boring, debate in economics about this concept called dynamic scoring. So I need to give you some background on what that is. So when Congress wants to know how much a given policy proposal is going to cost the government, the way that they do that is they ask the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation to give this proposal a score. So how much will it cost the government to expand health insurance under Obamacare? Or how much will it cost the government to cut taxes? And CBO and the JCT are meant to kind of report back, that's going to cost this much, or that's going to benefit the government in terms of revenues by this much. And so normally the way those scores are generated is they hold the macroeconomy fixed. So they don't take into account, is this going to spur economic growth? They're just kind of taking the economy as given. And it turns out the economists at some point were kind of saying, well, for tax cuts, if we cut taxes, that's going to spur economic activity, and that's going to encourage growth. So actually, we should be taking those effects into account because tax cuts are less costly than the score would suggest. And some people went so far as to say tax cuts could pay for themselves. And so it got to be this extremely partisan concept because dynamic scoring was raised for taxes. People varied a lot in their opinions on how much tax cuts would pay for themselves or not. And it was just seen as this very conservative idea. So two things happened that were interesting. So one is eventually CBO and the JCT did dynamically score some tax proposals. And it turns out that they scored them as just the growth effects are pretty small. So in some sense, dynamic scoring didn't really matter that much. It's not to say it never mattered, it depends on what the tax cuts are, but it's just we had this whole debate over something that kind of ended up not being that big of a deal. But the second thing that happened is that, for various reasons, that kind of debate got abandoned. And so nobody talks about dynamic scoring anymore, except for you're kind of seen as a very conservative person that's trying to re-raise this old debate. And so I had this insight from some conversations about a year and a half ago that I think we were totally having that debate on the wrong terms because actually even though the growth effects of tax cuts empirically are not that big, actually the growth effects of some other policies are really large. And so the example that I ran into that made this extremely salient was I was talking to some people that work in DC on kind of policy stuff about high-skilled immigrants, basically more green cards for STEM PhD holders. And they said, we give these proposals to CBO and staff of the JCT on we want more green cards for STEM PhDs. And they report back that that's a huge negative for the government budget. And there's some areas where the economics is not very clear, but that's one that you tell that to economists and they're just that's not the right answer, right? And it turns out that it isn't the right answer empirically, but if you're holding the macroeconomy fixed, you're holding the population fixed. And so they're basically not accounting for the fact that these immigrants come to the US and they're pretty high earning workers and they contribute a lot of wage taxes, but that's not getting counted in the score. But for reasons I don't quite understand, they are counting that those immigrants are eligible for Obamacare subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. So we're basically counting the costs that they might take up federal benefits, but we're not counting the fact that their wage tax revenues would more than pay for the benefits that they're expected to use. And so it turns out as soon as you realize that, you realize dynamic scoring hugely matters for immigration. And actually, you can bear that out empirically because we have done a version of dynamic scoring for 3 immigration proposals previously. By we, I mean the Congressional Budget Office. And in fact, yes, basically immigration suddenly looks absolutely it way pays for itself. Whereas if you're not doing dynamic scoring, it is a cost to the federal budget. And so one example that I kind of tabbed for 2 proposals, which were roughly doing the same thing of trying to make it easier to have green cards for STEM PhDs. If you do normal conventional scoring, it was negative $3 billion. And if you do this dynamic scoring, it was positive $110 billion. And so it's not small change. This is a huge difference. And you can also find these examples where very specific provisions in bills were getting dropped out because of the negative CBO score. And so you just think, oh my gosh, if Congress doesn't want to provide green cards for STEM PhDs because it's politically controversial, that's fine. But if these things are getting dropped out of these bills because we as the economics profession are kind of reporting back inaccurate budget impacts, that's terrible. And so I got very interested in maybe rather than having this debate about dynamic scoring be about taxes, which it never really should have been on, like we should be thinking about like when and where should dynamic scoring be used in case where it really matters. Like high-skilled immigration is one, but actually any policy that's trying to encourage productivity growth in the economy is oftentimes of the form, we need to make an investment now, for example, in research or infrastructure that's not going to pay off until later, and it's going to pay off through these growth effects. And so it's been like a really rewarding thing to work on because the inputs that are needed are research. And so, we're doing a big effort to try to link some census microdata with data on temporary visas so that we can do the research to talk about what is the contribution of immigrants to the economy in a way that quantifies the key parameters that you would need if CBO actually was going to dynamically score immigration. And so we are doing the research, but actually kind of a lot of the reason why it's like something that I suspect, I'll look back on as being like high impact, at some point down the road is because I feel like it's this recognition that I think we were having the debate on the wrong terms, but in order to shift to have the debate on the correct terms, you need some research to show people that the thing you're saying is not just an abstract idea, but that it actually is important. And research and data is the way that you kind of try to change that conversation. And so I found that to just be really rewarding, and it's also just been such a steep learning curve for me because I don't work on immigration. I knew nothing about budget scoring, but I've kind of collected this group of people, including Doug Elmendorf, who's one of the former Congressional Budget Office directors, who's very kindly been collaborating with me on this. But it's great to feel like one flexibility that you have as an academic is over time you can just start working on completely new areas and teach yourself a lot of things that you don't know. But very much in the spirit of the work that I mentioned with Michael Kremer before, I feel like this is all very much research that's drawn from, there's like a policy bottleneck that research is needed to try to overcome. And I've just found that like a really motivating force for my work. So.
Fine, you convinced me that dynamic scoring is interesting.
Good.
So you mentioned that you like to work on important problems that matter for society, but there are so many important problems. So how do you decide which problems to work on?
Yeah. So maybe Ron had more clarity on this forever. I remember when I was a junior faculty, if you would have asked me to articulate like why do you work on the problems you work on, I don't think I would have had like an intelligible answer to that question. And so I remember at some point my junior faculty mentor, who's an economist named Amy Finkelstein, who's at MIT, kind of, I had a talk with her about, my review, how am I doing as a junior faculty, and I was feeling very self-conscious because I wasn't writing as many papers as kind of a lot of my peers. And, I was kind of trying to ask, is that okay? Am I going to get fired from my job? And I remember Amy characterized it as, you're doing something that's a little bit different, but you're writing papers that other people wouldn't be writing. And that's like a different way to think about impact than just how many papers you're writing. And I think she understood me better than I understood myself in terms of what problems I was trying to work on. Because I think that idea of like, this is an important problem. Like I care enough about that if I learn something about this, I think that would be important to the world. But also that if I don't write this paper, I think other people are not going to write this paper. For me, that's like a very big guiding force into where I feel like I have value added in my work. And that may sound obvious, but actually it's quite different than a lot of incentives in academia. Oftentimes you hear about incentives for racing where, everybody knows what the important question is and there's like 8 teams racing to write the paper. But if you don't write it first, somebody else is going to write it 2 months later. That's just not, I don't find that very rewarding. That's not what I want to be doing. Like, I want to take the time I need to kind of get the right answer. And, I don't want to feel like I'm in a rush to do that because I'm in a race with some other people. And so I really like working on these spaces where there's not, the counterfactual impact of my work is just large because nobody's going to be writing the paper that I'm working on. And I don't feel like I'm in a rush to write a less good version of it. And so, but yeah, I think in general at a high level, this idea of like, problems that are big enough that I care about them, areas where like counterfactually the paper probably wouldn't have been written. And of course you need to have some technical idea that gives you leverage to actually work on the problem, And so I think that's like a pretty good synopsis of like how I choose my questions. When I talk to students, I always try to make sure to say that's not it's not meant to be prescriptive of like what you should do. And if anything, I feel like I like talking about that because I think it's different from the objective that a lot of people feel like is the default in academia, that like you should choose papers that are going to publish in top journals, right? Or like you should do papers that are going to be recognized by your peers. You can choose that as your objective if you want to. You can also choose my objective, or you can choose a different objective. Like academia is a place that can accommodate different methods of problem selection. And I think it's important that people not feel like academia is a box where there's like only one, right answer to how you choose questions. And so, I just appreciate you asking.
Yeah, it's interesting because last week Dan Jurafsky gave a similar answer to the question of like, if there are many teams that are racing and you need to do it fast in order to be recognized, maybe it means that you are not working on something that you matter that much because, so it's an interesting to hear this perspective. So last year you started collaborating with a new think tank, the Institute for Progress. Can you tell us about your work with them?
Sure. I was talking with Ran a little bit before class. One of my academic collaborators, Ben Jones, who's at Northwestern, and I, for a long time, had felt like we really wish there was a think tank in the innovation policy space. And there are think tanks that work on innovation policy issues, but they were very much of the form, someone in industry is concerned about some issue and they would like fund a grant to a think tank to work on a very specific issue area, as opposed to like, what do we think the most important innovation policy questions are where research should be getting translated into having an impact? And there was no think tank that was kind of working on that space. And so Ben and I were kind of shopping around to people like, we should have something, but like Ben and I aren't going to start a think tank, that wasn't really our comparative advantage. And so I was at a conference and I met this young 28-year-old guy at dinner, and I was like, oh, what do you do? And he's like, oh, I just started a new think tank on innovation policy. And I was like, you did? Tell me more, And it turns out that he and his collaborator, who were both about the same age, indeed had kind of had a very similar idea. They had worked at various think tanks in DC. They felt like the think tanks, it's the same as the problem selection question that we were talking about. So, they felt like there were important questions where research could really make a difference in the conversation, but that none of the think tanks were really engaged in those in the innovation policy space. And so they decided to start their own think tank and had a much clearer vision, so we're much more successful than Ben and I were in like trying to navigate around on that. And so it's a very interesting place for many reasons. They value research and getting the right answer as very core to the work that they do. And, as opposed to some think tanks, I think, take research as given and think of the job as to translate it out, but they actually do a lot of basic research in-house. And so, one example that's not that closely related to my work is there's this wonderful guy named Brian Potter who is affiliated with the Institute for Progress, he's an engineer. He kind of worked in the construction sector, and in particular, he worked at a construction startup that failed. And then he started to realize that actually a lot of the construction startups that he thought were really promising had failed. And he got quite interested in why is it hard to innovate in the construction sector, and why has productivity in the construction sector not been improving over time? And so he basically self-taught himself a lot of economics and a lot of economic history, and is now kind of just, I think of as like one of the most thoughtful researchers measuring productivity in the economy and like why productivity is higher in some sectors than others. And his work has just been incredibly informative, I think, for thinking about what the right policy tools are to improve productivity in the economy. So one example is there's a lot of policy discussion over the last few years about reforming the permitting process. So, if you want to build something in the US, you often need to go through several layers of like regulatory and permitting approval. And some of Brian's research, which is, real basic research, was just showing that actually the policy discussion at some point was focused on things that weren't just likely to be ineffective, but were actually likely to be counterproductive. And his research kind of informed that actually a different set of proposals looked like they would be like more appropriate for addressing the underlying problems. And so it's just such an interesting place where this person from a very non-traditional background, who's essentially a self-taught economist, is doing really high impact basic research that is then saying that the policy discussion is probably focused on the wrong things. And it's been very generative for me to be in a place that I feel like has a similar compass on like how they're selecting problems. But it's also very different from academia in the sense that in academia, the way that you get to be kind of a fancy professor like Ron is you have a lot of work with your name attached to it that really matters. And that's very different in the policy context, actually. So a lot of the highest impact work doesn't have anybody's name attached to it. You're just worried about kind of documenting facts and evidence and getting them out in the world to have an impact. And so it's very interesting to kind of contrast. In some sense, it's the same. We're doing research on important problems, but actually kind of the way that people are involved is just very different from academia in that way. And I've personally found that really rewarding in the sense that I think it kind of creates like a much broader set of people that are kind of brought in to have their work be valued, from non-traditional backgrounds. And it's also something where I've just gotten more opportunities from spending time in DC to kind of learn more about what questions are relevant that I never would have thought of if I would have been in my office kind of at a university. And so, I think different people get different things out of spending time in DC doing policy work. Normally when economists go to DC, they go to Treasury or they go to the Council of Economic Advisors and they do kind of whatever someone in that job needs to do during the time that they're there. And I've been doing something very different, which is I'm interested in innovation policy, and I kind of tried to landscape what are the federal agencies that are working on innovation policy, and what are the ways that I could go spend time with them, talking with them about specifically things in that area. And it's just been extremely generative for me on surfacing research questions that I never would have thought of. And it's also really shaped how I think about the value of students going to spend time in DC, because I think oftentimes this idea of wanting to do policy relevant research can come about in different forms. But for me, I really enjoy doing policy relevant research in the sense of having my problems that I select be motivated by ones that the institutions that I would, want to have their decisions be informed by the research that I do. That's actually kind of an important generator of which problems I'm working on in the first place. And so I've just really appreciated this think tank as kind of a way to support me. Like I almost feel like I'm doing a postdoc with these two 28-year-old guys, which is a funny way to describe it, but it's just, they are very thoughtful about the economics, but they also know a lot of stuff that I don't know about kind of how to think about the policy context for my work. And it's just been like a really rewarding phase of my career for me to learn from them. So.
When talking to you, it's clear that you mentioned a lot of people and how they've been affecting positively your career. So I wanted to ask, what kinds of people do you look to as role models?
Yeah. So one thing is, I'm in a very privileged position to say this, and so I don't want to take for granted when I say that. But when possible, you should try to spend time you should make your role models your mentors when you can. Of course, you can't always do that. Sometimes your role models are people that you don't have any opportunity to interact with. But I think in life, when you can get the opportunity to make your role model someone that is your collaborator or your mentor, that's like a really important way to try to surround yourself by people that inspire you to do more ambitious versions and like better versions of your work in a way that can also really be a direct form of support and engagement in you doing that. And so, I'm an academic economist. Academics do lots of different things, right? We do research, we do teaching, we do advising, we do, many of us, Ran and I both, I think, try to engage in some public impact of our work. And I would say that I also find it helpful to have role models or mentors that are different in those different spheres, because I think oftentimes the people that inspire you to do a better version of those different activities are just different in different contexts. And so, for me now, my research mentors, probably the main one is actually somebody I won't name because they're a federal agency employee, but it's definitely like people that help me connect my work to the impact that I'm trying to have it have. Sometimes you can name the former agency employees that serve that role in your life. So Doug Elmendorf is definitely one of the people that I think has been really, really supportive of me and a great mentor and role model for me. And then there's also some academics that are really trying to translate research into practical impact, but are also just more on the research mentor side. And so Scott Stern at MIT and Ben Jones, who I mentioned before, are both very much serving that role. I think a lot about how to mentor students, and mentoring comes in many forms. Sometimes it's teaching. I think it's so great that Ran is doing this class, because this is the kind of class that I think would have inspired me to do something different than maybe I would have thought to do otherwise. Teaching in general can really have that flavor. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking over time of how can I have an impact with my teaching? And the people that I talk to about how to design my classes and how to think about, should we be doing a summer school? Should we do an online class as a complement to the teaching at our home universities? And how can we expand our reach of the students that we're supporting? So There's one kind of traditional academic that I collaborate a lot with that, which is Paul Niehaus at UCSD. There's also a wonderful guy named Matt Clancy who's gone kind of in and out of academia, is now working at a philanthropy that also I collaborate a lot with him on my teaching and advising. But they both just inspire me to do kind of like a more ambitious version of the way that I support students than I feel like I would be doing on my own. Definitely on the public impact side, Alex Stapp and Caleb Watney, who are the co-CEOs of the Institute for Progress, are absolute role models for me in that sense. I think it's also just worth saying kind of at a high level, there's some people that are, even if you know them directly and they are a mentor of yours, you might not get a lot of their time. But some of my most important mentors are people that maybe I talk to once every 6 months, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be somebody that's a mentor in a very direct sense of like, I go to their office every morning to talk to them. I would think of it as like the people that give you advice that you wouldn't hear otherwise, that you feel like really shapes how you think about the work that you want to do. And then the last thing I would just say is I think it's really helpful to also have role models and mentors that are not just in your area. So for me, a lot of the people that I listed are economists. Some of my most important role models and mentors are not economists that I feel like are interested and drawn to similar problems, but with a very different toolkit. And they also inspire me to do kind of a broader social impact version of my work in a different way. So one is a lawyer that I work really closely with. Another is a journalist who I work really closely with, so Amy Nice and Dylan Matthews, who's at Vox. But it's important to kind of interact with people that broaden your perspective on kind of how to bring like social impact to your work. And if you're doing that all within fields, I think that can often be sort of an artificial boundary that isn't that helpful in the end.
So finally, before I open it up to questions from the audience, what advice would you give students interested in a career in economics?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I worry about is that a lot of people may select out of going to get a PhD in economics because they look at economists and they think, I'm not interested in doing the work that I see them doing. And there's lots of things you can do with an economics PhD that may not be the thing that you kind of most directly observe. And so, just as an example, like a lot of economists work in government, a lot of economists work at nonprofits, a lot of economists do kind of direct service work with NGOs, a lot of economists work at private firms and kind of really find it rewarding to kind of add a lot of value to the private economy through that. And so, you may not meet them at Stanford. You see your professors, teaching, and maybe you think, well, that's not the career path that I want. But actually, a degree in economics is something that is just really flexible to contribute to whatever problems you feel like are most important. And so, with Paul Niehaus, who I mentioned before, is kind of somebody I collaborate a lot with my teaching and advising. I think he and I have been trying to think about like what are like institutional mechanisms we can put in place to support students that might have different career aspirations to kind of help them see that like a career in economics like might be for them, even if they don't naturally think it is, and it's just something that I think the more that we can have conversations about how do you choose the problems you work on, and people realizing that that doesn't need to be kind of just, I do things that are of academic interest. No, it doesn't need to be like that. You might find research incredibly rewarding because you want to go do research that's going to inform, better government policy or better, just to give an example with Paul, so when Paul was a junior faculty at UCSD, he co-founded Give Directly, which is one of the largest direct cash transfer programs. And so he was doing that instead of being solely focused on getting tenure, right? Like that was just like his side gig. And so, but you can do that. And yeah, it turns out he used Give Directly also as a platform to measure the impacts of cash transfers on people and on the economy. And so in that case, it wasn't really an either or, I'm doing my research or I'm doing my academic job and then I'm doing this nonprofit work on the side. But there can be other people like Paul. Like you can be drawn to economics because you want to improve the world, but research can be a way of how you do that. And so I think Give Directly was better because they did research. And that's something that I just think, I hope that more students will see the language and toolkit of economics as something that itself can be actually an incredibly high impact mechanism for social impact, even though, it may not look to you like, a lot of economists are kind of directly engaged in that kind of work in the way that Paul was, so.
Professor Heidi Williams. So Jenna and Gabriele will work, if you have questions, just raise your hands, they will find you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah.
I was wondering, in your research, have you ever gone into the realms of behavioral economics or behavioral science, especially when you're talking about things such as patents and their impacts on innovation?
No. It wasn't for lack of interest. Actually, when I was first thinking about choosing a PhD program at the time, I thought I wanted to do behavioral economics, and it just ended up that never felt like kind of the most natural interface with the problems that I was studying. And so, just as an example, like there's lots of cases where we think firms make mistakes all the time in their investments, and where we think behavioral economics is a really important. Pharmaceutical firms is not the main sector that people think about. Like people think that actually pharmaceutical firms are like incredibly well calibrated on, they have spreadsheets, they evaluate the expected returns, they make investments accordingly. We have a lot of empirical papers that kind of suggest they're extremely responsive to small changes in incentives. So it's quite possible there are behavioral biases, but it just never felt like the most important part of the sector that I was studying. But it's not for lack of interest at all. It was just, it ended up being kind of not the natural place for me to work.
I had a quick question. Forgive me if this is a simple question, but I was just kind of curious about your data collection process and like what methods you use to glean insight from the data that you do collect.
Yes. So it's very heterogeneous, but I would say at a high level, I often try to learn things from things that other people don't think of as data, and that the process of translating something that exists in the world into data that it can actually analyze is oftentimes pretty time intensive. And so, just to give some examples, so my PhD dissertation, like I said, I needed to learn like enough molecular biology to basically take these data sets that were curated by the National NIGMS, National Institute for Genetic Medical Sciences, probably is the acronym, although I'm sure I'm messing that up. But like they're curated for molecular biologists to have kind of reference data sets. But I realized that actually you could use those data to measure the economic quantities that I was interested in. But like they're not set up to be kind of put in a regression form, right? These are meant to be queried individually, like who else is working on my gene, or like what happened to my gene over time. And so, it's kind of like, in one hand, it was very easy. Ron spends a lot of time digitizing data. It was all digital, so it wasn't digitization, but it was like me learning enough science to understand how to put together the relevant data sets and kind of put them into a file format that mattered. So just to give one example, it turns out, I thought of it as gene patents, but it turns out there's this concept of messenger RNAs, which is like really important, and some genes have multiple messenger RNAs, and then I had to decide like, should I think about different parts of the analysis being at the mRNA level or the gene level? Guess how many economists have opinions on that? None, right? So then I was like, gosh, I feel like I'm kind of out on my own, like trying to figure out how to appropriately use the data. And thankfully my PhD advisors were very kind and introduced me to some scientists who I could like go talk to, right? Because you basically need some person with expertise in molecular genetics that is willing to talk to a PhD student in economics who doesn't really know what her question is. And so who does David Cutler, one of my advisors, send me to? Eric Lander, who it turns out is like runs the Broad Institute, is this like incredibly well-respected, basic science researcher, but actually in his past life used to teach at Harvard Business School and actually knows a lot of economists and is very literate about talking to economists. So I went over to talk to Eric Lander and I explained roughly what I was doing, and it took him about 30 seconds to immediately understand what I was doing. And he was like, here's kind of a bunch of feedback on your thing. Also, why don't you come present at the Broad Institute? We'll like give you some feedback on what you're doing. And it was basically a way for me to make sure that I was doing well by the data that I was collecting, to make sure I was measuring things appropriately, and kind of like, because I feel like if you're using the census data, economists use the census data all the time, and they'll tell you if you're using the wrong variable, like you shouldn't use occupation in that year because actually that's kind of mismeasured, right? But I wasn't able to get feedback on some of the most important parts of my work from economists, and so I felt like I needed to go to the people that had the relevant expertise. And so that's a theme that comes up a lot in my work, and also comes up honestly a lot in my students' work, whether it's like going to do a deep dive with the Food and Drug Administration to understand their data. So one of my PhD students here, Maya Darbasula, just finished this paper that we wrote with 3 patent lawyers to basically try to write a user's guide for some Food and Drug Administration administrative data that even the Food and Drug Administration did not have kind of full documentation of. And Maya just did this like incredibly impeccable job of kind of going through, I remember there was some question that she found like an archived video on YouTube that was like the only source we could find with the answer, right? But it's just like this data exists, but you don't know that you're using it correctly unless you really do the legwork to kind of track down the details. And so I would say that it's important to get feedback on your work from the original creators of the data and to understand where it's coming from. And then, of course, you also want feedback from economists on like, am I analyzing this data in a way that's kind of doing right by the economics? But that kind of translational process for me is very rewarding because I feel like it surfaces opportunities to learn new facts that we wouldn't learn otherwise because not a lot of other people are going to spend the time putting together that data. But it is time consuming and, I appreciate working with, especially lawyers that help me make sure that we're doing that correctly. So.
Hi, I had a question related to sort of what you were talking about with counterfactuals, but more the counterfactual related to like if you had not become an economist, because it seems like some of the questions that you're trying to answer sort of triangulate between maybe the public sector, the private sector, academia, and research. And, there are different ways to approach these problems. So I'm curious, sort of, maybe if you could speak more to how you gained the conviction that going down the PhD route was the right choice and sort of how students can determine maybe where they would best be suited.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's one that I think really deserves like a lot of careful thought. And it's also a good reason not to rush into going to get a PhD. And so, it's very unusual. There's like one other economist that I know that did this. I didn't want to go get a PhD until I felt like I knew which questions I wanted to work on. That's not the normal thing. Almost everybody goes to get a PhD because they're like drawn to economics and they'll figure out the questions later. But like I didn't want to go get a PhD and figure it out later. I only wanted to go get a PhD if I felt like I knew why I wanted the PhD. And so waiting for your PhD is not for everybody, but for me, that was kind of the right thing. So I kind of knew what problems I wanted to work on, and they were problems where I could have gone to law school, like I could have like done an MPP and kind of worked directly in policy, like I could have done a lot of things. And that experience that I described of working for Michael Kremer on this advanced market commitment project, I worked mostly with people that were not economists, and I kind of got a sense of what they were bringing to the problems, how they were shaping the discussion, what skills I felt like were scarce in the room, and like also what I liked about, the different parts of the problem that I was exposed to. And so I think for me, the main advice I would have is if there's a problem that you feel passionate about, going to work in an environment where you're working with a lot of people who are working on the same problem but with very different skill sets, I think can be extremely informative about kind of which part of that you feel like most naturally dovetails with what your interests are. So, in my case, like I just felt like I really cared about making sure we were getting the right data and making sure we were kind of drawing the right conclusions from that data. And that very much puts you in the, I think I would be happiest doing research category, even though I did enjoy working with the lawyers on kind of how to write the contracts. And like, I did enjoy, interfacing directly with kind of, in this case, they were interested in like, what are the costs of development for different kinds of pharmaceuticals? And like, there you can imagine going to work in industry or kind of like working on, there's some private firms that collect data from industry. But that was just not the, I appreciated that somebody needed to be doing that on the team, but that wasn't what I personally found like most rewarding. Or like you can imagine more on the policy side, like somebody needed to write some briefs that were going to, the relevant Hill staffers. And like, I understood and I could contribute to that, but that wasn't where I felt like my personal value added was kind of highest. And so I think for me, it's very similar to the problem selection question. It's kind of like if you take the problem as fixed, you can still think about like where am I having kind of the largest impact with my work given my interests and skills. And I think that for me really guided how I thought about career decisions conditional on kind of a question or topic area that I was most interested in. So.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I just had a quick question when you were talking about sort of your motivations being an economist and sort of how you see the field of economics playing out. You mentioned that you're drawn to economics because you can solve social problems using sort of like empirical data sets and skills. And I was just curious what you see as the difference between, say, an economist and like a data scientist or a statistician or somebody who works broadly in data analytics, and what specifically you think maybe the field of economics has to offer to somebody who's interested in pursuing those empirical questions.
Yeah, great question. Just to correct one thing for the record, so I wouldn't say that we get to solve problems, but I think we can make progress on important problems. So, and maybe eventually we solve some of them, but that's like a rare outcome. So, so I think this is a great question, partly because it really relates to kind of, clarity of thought on what the field of economics has to contribute. I think is something that we should really value because it should inform how we teach our students. It should inform how we support our students in their career paths. And, it should just be like a really guiding fundamental thing. But we actually like never talk about, what makes economics research valuable in the world. So, how do I describe this? So I think economists often very productively collaborate with data scientists. And so it's not that they would never overlap in the problems that they work on. I think in my experience, economics as a field has like a very powerful way of bringing theory and kind of conceptual frameworks to the table that often highlight different aspects of human behavior that we wouldn't otherwise think to go measure in the data if it weren't for the theory. And so that's something that is not absent, I'm sure, from data science, but it seems quite different in the sense that, I think economics as its core is trying to say, we care about understanding decisions that individuals and firms make and how those aggregate into economic outcomes that we care about. And that can be formalized in theory, it can be tested empirically, but the coherent framework is all about understanding behavior. Whereas I tend to think of data science a little bit more as kind of taking an objective as given, we want to, do a better job of kind of measuring this bias, in a particular process, and we're going to do that. But it's a little bit harder to connect it back to kind of the broad framework and motivation for kind of what policy lever might we want to design differently as a function of the empirical lever that we kind of quantified. And so what I think, one reason that I feel especially drawn to economics is just, I think the theory actually serves like a really important bridge between data and facts and interpreting those data facts in a way that can inform not necessarily policy recommendations, but kind of informed quantification of the costs and benefits of different policy options in a way that's not partisan and not kind of biased by people's opinions, but rather is directly informed by kind of what hopefully are accurate theoretical models that kind of give us a lens for interpreting the data and facts that we've generated. And so I'm sure on a different day you would catch me and give me a different answer because I haven't really thought about that before. But I think economics empirically has more policy impact, I think, than kind of empirical work that's not directly engaged with economics. And I think for me, the reason I'm in economics is because I think it has the potential to shape policy, not necessarily change policy, but I just want to be doing work that informs how to think about the costs and benefits of different policies. And I think economics as a field just gives a lens to do that much more directly. So.
Thank you so much for this informative talk. So you mentioned kind of the interaction between private sector and policy. I would just love to learn more about kind of your ideas on the recent Inflation Reduction Act's impact on drug development. Specifically, there's a lot of concerns around kind of the development of small molecule drugs and orphan diseases. So that's question one, is kind of the impact on drug development. And two is sort of what do you foresee the industry's adoption or reaction to this policy would be going forward, because we also saw some reactions such as from Merck kind of suing the federal government. So curious about those two questions. Thanks
Sure.
so much.
Yeah, so for people that don't know, the Inflation Reduction Act apparently had lots of things to do with things other than inflation. So one of the things that it did is it set aside a number of drugs where there were going to be price, caps, controls. I don't know the right term. I'm going to not get the details quite right. But as places where they wanted to do kind of a concerted effort to reduce prices. one concern with that is, a version of what we talked about before. If you cap prices, that could reduce the incentives to develop certain kinds of drugs in the future. And so it turns out there's some quite well-developed kind of empirical frameworks that people have for that. So Chris Adams, who I mentioned before, who's now at the Congressional Budget Office, whose work informed the advanced market commitment work, he brought his model to CBO to kind of score how many fewer drugs do you think we're going to get, given this price reduction. And the number exists, but it's relatively small. That, I believe, as far as I've gleaned from his public presentations, is scoring in this very direct sense of kind of the list is this many drugs long, and what do we think the impact of that is. I think one thing that, and I've talked to Chris about this, so it's not meant as a criticism of his work, is if firms see this not as the Inflation Reduction Act has a fixed set of drugs that this is happening for, but rather this is kind of a foot in the door for some broader form of price regulations, then the industry reaction could look very incommensurate with the policy, which is very small and very narrow, right? And so, but I think if you talk to firms, a lot of them do view this as a foot in the door for some broader price controls. And then it's not surprising that then the industry response might be kind of large, right? And so, but that's a hard thing to say, because really what it's saying is that firms' expectations of future price reductions are not well captured by just measuring the direct policy impact of what Congress actually passed. But then we don't measure directly firms' expectations. We don't really know how to scale that. And so I, in my personal capacity might have a view of what I think that scaling factor should be, but it's not really informed by data in a way that I feel comfortable speculating on how many more drugs do I think won't be developed, and of course the trade-off is that people do have more access to the drugs we have now. So then it also depends on how long of a time horizon are we talking about. If people have more access to drugs because the prices are lower in the next 10 years before those drugs go off patent and would have been generic anyway, how do we value that relative to make it fewer drugs developed, 10 or 20 years from now? And those are trade-offs that they just require making assumptions about how much you value different things. And they're hard questions, and it's not something that economists, necessarily are the ones that kind of can inform those trade-offs. That's kind of a political thing. Bernie Sanders has a different view than kind of a lot of other people in Congress on what the relevant trade-off of those two things is. And so, it's just, I think it's a really interesting and hard area, and there was a lot of economics that went into thinking carefully about what the very direct impacts are, but I think these indirect effects could or could not be larger, and it's a little bit hard to know right now.
Before I ask you to joining me again in thanking Heidi, this wonderful event with Heidi concludes our Big Ideas event series. You can find the 10 video recordings of all the events on the course website and on YouTube. I would like to thank all the speakers for finding the time to come and have a conversation with us. I also want to thank the CEMEX team for their support throughout the course, to Lipo from the School of HNS, and especially our wonderful TA, Jenna Kowalski, for her fantastic support, along with Gabriele and Tamri. And I want to thank you all. I hope you enjoyed the course, and I wish you the best of luck in your future career at Stanford and beyond. So with that, Heidi, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation.
Thanks.